Hello, hello. Today I'll be talking about Unit 2 of US History, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. So let's get right into it. Here's the organization of this presentation. You can pause now, read it all if you'd like, but I'm just going to hop right in. I want to start with our key vocabulary. I know there's a lot of vocabulary you could know for this section, but I'd find three key terms I think are the most helpful for your essays. The first is the Emancipation Proclamation. This was the presidential executive order during the war that said all slaves shall be free. It was very significant at the time as Abraham Lincoln, he was fighting this war, claiming that he didn't really want to take away slavery and that the South was mostly overreacting to him becoming president. And there's also debate whether this is not historically significant, but truly effective, as the South didn't really respect him at the time. But we'll go more into that later. We have also the radical Republicans. These were the Republicans, aka ones that are on Abraham Lincoln's party, who strongly wanted to punish the South and give African Americans rights. And this is mostly effective after the Civil War, where they're in the government. And then we have the Reconstruction, which is from a period from 1865 to 1877, which is the process of restoring rights to African Americans and uniting the South with the North once more. So this was recovering from the war in general and also a significant social change. So now we need to ask ourselves, why did the Civil War last 4 years? The first topic is resource availability. So in general, if we look at these charts, we see that the North, aka the Union, had a lot more stuff. They had more population, they did have more farms, they did have more value of farmland, which is interesting. They had more railway mileage, they had more factories, more workers, more value of these factories, more banks, etc. They were a lot better equipped in general. However, the South had more farms in general, so they could feed their people better, they could supply the war effort a lot, and also they had more military colleges and military leaders. So when they go into this war, they're going to be really strong with their military and supplying their soldiers with food. So for the leadership, we have Abraham Lincoln on the north side. He was very charismatic, he was very likable by the people, he was able to really get that morale up, but he was not really a good military leader. I almost think of this like George Washington in the American Revolutionary War, how he was a really good leader, yeah, but not on the battlefield. He had to hire other people first. Then we have Jefferson Davis, who is a leader of the South. He's not really super charismatic, but he's good at military stuff, which is really good. And also, he can really direct those military leaders that they have a lot more clearly. Though he's also bad at economics, and I think at one point they were trying to create a new economy for the South, like a new kind of currency, and straight up that crashed hard. They went into, I don't know if it was called hyperinflation, yeah. They went into major hyperinflation because of that, so Jefferson Davis, he generally had a good head on his shoulders, but he wasn't the best at much. And in general, you can also mention that this war lasted so long because both these guys were super duper stubborn. Neither of them wanted to give up. Lincoln viewed the South as part of the United States, therefore they couldn't secede. Jefferson Davis was like, yo, this is our life. We like slavery. It fuels our lives. It makes our farms work. It makes our private businesses work, if you will. And these two are super stubborn. It's a political war, so it's neither side is going to really change their mind. So they have to be pretty much, I don't want to say beaten into submission in order for this to end. But we also have their military strategies. So even though the North wasn't the best at their military stuff in the beginning, they eventually formed the Anaconda Plan, which was to block all the southern ports so they couldn't receive stuff from other countries or even just like from waters. And you have to acknowledge that the South doesn't really have many factories, so they really rely on their imports to get a lot of this valuable stuff, to get guns, to get armor, etc. And also, they want to break the Confederacy into two at the Mississippi River in order to separate the troops. Because if, let's say, they have 100 people and the North has 100 people, let's say the population is equal, even though it wasn't at the time, if they split it into two, that'll be 50 fighting some random amount and 50 fighting random amount. So the South has a much higher chance to lose if that's the case. And it was also, this strategy was seen in World War II and all that kind of stuff. And I believe also World War I. It's a pretty effective strategy in general. And also, they wanted to destroy the transportation and communication systems of the South. This will lead to lower morale, so they'd be more likely to give up. And also, their final point was to attack the Confederate capital at Richmond. They just thought it was significant. It was the capital, it represents their heart. So if they can attack that, it'll significantly lower morale, and most likely they'd win. And also we have the South's plan, which is the cordon strategy. This one you don't really hear about as much. I say the Anaconda plan is generally more significant, but it's still important to acknowledge that the South had an active plan to this. Their troops were scattered from Virginia to Texas trying to defend the border, which is honestly not a good strategy because this is just splitting up his troops really easily. And Jefferson Davis didn't want to do it, but he felt like he had to, considering that they were playing the defensive and they had a lot of land that they had to cover on the perimeter. So here's a picture of both their strategies. You have the North that's trying to like we call it the anaconda plan because it's sort of like an anaconda snake. It's like blocking off all the imports and attacking through the middle of it to try to divide the troops. And then we have the South, which is sort of just standing on the borders with their guns, just hoping that they'll shoot someone from the Union. Now, this looks a bit overwhelming, all the battles, but I promise it's not that bad. We have the Battle of Fort Sumter, which was 1861. This one started the war. This is won by the Confederate. Then we have the Battle of Bull Run, which is the first major land battle for this. And it's also won by the Confederate again, so North is really surprised by a Southern victory. They sort of assumed it'd be quickly over and it would just be, South's taken care of. Okay, they can go cry about it, but, it's all done. And also, the South is really hyped about this. They think it's going to be a really quick war. Haha, it's not. Because there's also in 1862, they have the Battle of Monitor versus Merrimack, I think that's pronounced. This is the first clash between ironclad warships, so these like giant behemoths on the sea. And this really changed the future of naval warfare, of their strategies of going at it, at that being also a valid opportunity. No one really won this, but both the sides claimed that they won, so it's just a tie in general, and both of them were sort of sore losers about that. Then we have the Battle of Antietam, which I think is, I don't know how to say really any of these, but it was the first significant Union win, and it was also in 1862. This is when Lincoln felt like he could finally post the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll get to really soon. Then we have the Battle of 1863, also won by the Union. It's the Battle of Gettysburg, where the South finally tried to invade the North. They stopped playing that defensive and started invading, which is really the turning point where the Union starts winning a lot more, and we see the shift in military strategy. We have the Battle of Vicksburg, won by the Union, where the Union finally took control of that Mississippi River we talked about earlier with the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to take control of it so they could split the South into two, and that's exactly what they did, eventually and finally. Then we have the Battle of Atlanta in 1864, where Atlanta, Georgia was burned to the ground. I didn't have if the Union or Confederate won on this one, but I'm 99% sure the Union won because that is an area in the South. And this has also been called the March to the Sea, where they destroyed a lot of property and a lot of lands. Then at the very end, we have the Appomattox Courthouse. This is just what ended the war, and the Union won. And I base my videos and presentations on what the AICE syllabus says that we need to know. And they want to know about foreign influence, but honestly, there wasn't a lot of it. Previously, Britain and the South were very tight with each other. The South didn't have many factories, so they'd buy from Britain and get their products that way because they sent a lot of their raw products to the North so they can make their stuff into processed goods. So, but during this war, Britain didn't really get too involved that much. They wanted to stay away from the conflict. They didn't want to get into a war themselves. They were soon going to head into industrialization, so they wanted to prioritize some of that. But then we also have the Trent Affair, which is where I believe it was the Union that attacked a British boat, thinking it was from the South, and that almost caused Britain to join the war. But generally, nothing happened. They just apologized and it was done for. But it generally increased tensions, and that's significant. If they ask about the Trent Affair, you could say that. And then we have France, which was also neutral, but sort of looked at Mexico a little. Essentially, I believe like France got a new leader, and they're like, "Yo, let's get something to make ourselves hype." But nothing really significant happened towards this. It was just that was really the only other foreign influence I could find for this kind of segment. And also, we have how significant was the immediate impact of the Civil War. We have the limitations of civil liberties. We have the idea of habeas corpus, which is when a person charged with a crime must be brought into a courtroom and hear what they've been charged with. Oh my god, I can't remember what amendment this is, but it's generally called the Miranda rights, a plea to the fifth, I believe it is. But generally, Abraham Lincoln violated this a lot to immediately arrest people who supported the Confederacy in any kind of way. This wasn't really a big phenomenon, but it's pretty significant since America is founded on wanting more rights and wanting this independence and freedom to have pure justice, or however you'd word that. And Jefferson Davis also did this, but it's not really talked about that much because we don't really talk about the Confederate States of America history. We talk about the United States of America, and the Union remained clearly part of America, so that's what we talk about a little bit more. Also, this habeas corpus stuff, like the way Abraham Lincoln violated it, it was sort of unfair because it was like, oh, if you just support the Confederacy, which can arguably mean a lot, like as if you're a farmer down there, you're technically giving them food. If you're a slave down there, are you supporting them? And etc. etc. It was just problematic. So also about their general life. So the Northerners, they didn't really view the war super serious. Some of them just went on their lives normally, and they could also pay to get out of the draft that was later installed. And they're also pretty upset about the drafts. They didn't want to get drafted into war, so they're really upset. Not to mention, I say could pay to get out of the draft. Mostly the rich people could pay to get out of it. It wasn't a very cheap thing to do. Also, we had the Southerners, their homes are being destroyed. They're really upset about that. But they could also hire a substitute to replace them in the draft, which was sort of neat. And they could also recruit their slaves to fight with them. But the drafts were also generally unpopular as well. No one was happy that they had to fight in the war, even if they generally supported the war effort or the war idea overall. Then we have the Homestead Act. I have that little image there. Was happening at a time where there were incentives to move westward in the United States, so more towards that left side of that region. And this is because a lot of it was unoccupied. So what they would do is say, hey, you move over there, you own some farmland, you take care of it, you grow crops, you make it profitable, and then we'll pay you little money or pretty much cover the cost of the land. It was a really good incentive. A lot of people participated in it. I just think it was a little bit funny that happened during the same time as the Civil War because like imagine this entire war going on. Is you and your family just moving to the left? Not really too much. Really chill. So overall, the Homestead Acts really serve as more so like a loyalty program for the North because it was the federal government offering it. So they weren't going to offer this free money to move to the South because they're like actively fighting them. So it was really just a loyalty and incentive to stick with the Union. Because also, when they have that new land over towards the left, they can use it for farmland, which is going to be used for food. That's going to support more of the war effort. Then we have the very famous Emancipation Proclamation. This is what, after the anti-Vietnam victory in the Civil War, Lincoln was finally like, yo, Emancipation Proclamation, all slaves are now free. But however, this does not include the slaves in the border states, which were almost like being neutral. I wouldn't say being neutral in the war, but they were on the Union side, yet they still support slavery in general. And so Lincoln was like, yo, the slaves that are on the sides against us, yeah, they're free. But the ones that are helping us, oh no, they can stay. And he said that these slaves can freely leave the South and go towards the North to help with the war effort. And they'd eventually, be free. But from a Southern perspective, this doesn't have like any credibility behind it. Imagine that like you're part of a country, you're doing good for a while, then you're not, and you're like, yo, I'm a secede, I'm not really part of you anymore. And then this Lincoln guy is like, well, your slaves are mine now? Like, no, they aren't. Lincoln doesn't have really much authority to say that anymore. So it wasn't really effective as it should have been, or as it's sometimes said to be, but some slaves were able to fight, which is generally a good idea. And these slaves really hoped that they, as fighting the war, they would make them entitled to more rights. They'd have some kind of reward for fighting in the war, which makes sense if you think about it. If this war is generally about the idea of slavery, they hope that fighting in this war will eventually lead towards slavery being abolished and them having as many rights as. So, what were the aims and outcomes of Reconstruction? This is a period that somewhat starts during the war, but also continues a lot after the war, up till 1877, I believe. So there's three views on this Reconstruction. We have that the South is not that bad. We have the three people. We have Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and the Radical Republicans. They go from, oh, the South is sort of chilling, to the South is absolutely horrible and should die, and not necessarily should be seceded, but they should just completely change. There was Abraham Lincoln who had the 10% plan, which is that if a state had 10% of their people being loyal to the Union, then they could successfully have their state turn towards the Union and eventually side. So after 10% of their men take a loyalty oath, boom, they sort of have their government reestablished and they're part of the United States again. He also established the Emancipation Proclamation to free slavery. This may not have much legislative value, but it still had emotional value at the time. And also, he sort of died, like, literally, I want to say 3 or 4 days after the war, so he wasn't really able to do much in general for Reconstruction. But those were his general ideas about the whole idea of Reconstruction. Then we have Andrew Johnson, who takes place soon after, and he thought the South was bad, but racism is okay because he didn't really support rich people who profited from slavery. He was more into like almost like mom and pop plantations, which is a really weird idea, but that was his take on it. He wanted the 50% plan, which is basically Abraham Lincoln's idea, but it would need to be 50% of the people, not just 10%. He also vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau, which would provide resources to African Americans after the war to make them on a more equal level because they're coming out of slavery. They're coming from a place where they were not able to earn any money. They were not able to earn any like education, or if they did, it was very, very rare. So that bureau would hopefully provide that, and Johnson just freed. He also vetoed the Civil Rights Act, and also he was really trying to impeach people. In the Senate, it was full of a bunch of radical Republicans, and he was like, yo, I want all y'all out of here. So he started firing people. But as a president, he's legally not able to do that because if a president can just fire a bunch of people, that's going to lead to a lot of corruption, a lot of political bias, and it's not going to be as fair and just as it should be. So Andrew Johnson gets impeached for this, but he does not get removed from office. He's saved by just one vote. So he still remains president, and pretty much this almost impeachment, it really ruins his reputation. He's not really respected after that. Then we have the radical Republicans, which I just mentioned. They thought the South was absolutely horrible. They thought it was so bad, they should just rot in prison pretty much. So the radical Republicans made the Wade-Davis bill, which is really, really similar to Andrew Johnson's plan. It required a 50% loyalty oath, but it required an ironclad loyalty oath, saying that they had never turned against the Union and they were always loyal, which is a lot of people to have never ever turned, right? And this was vetoed very, very quickly, so it never really got put in place, but that was their idea for what they wanted. And they also made states include the 13th and 14th Amendments. The 13th abolished slavery, and the 14th made African Americans classified as citizens, pretty much a birthright citizenship. So anyone that was born in the United States was considered a citizen. And they also had enforcement acts with the military zones that said that they would put military down in the South to make sure that they were following these enforcements, that they weren't still continuing slavery behind their backs. And I just talked about a little bit about the amendments, but also a significant part about the 14th Amendment is it defines citizenship for the first time, which is really interesting. And then the 15th Amendment, it allowed African Americans to vote. It allowed men to vote no matter what their race were. And women got upset about this one. The suffragette movement is slowly rising. We see some of our abolitionists from earlier turning into the suffragettes. And yeah, so this doesn't really take much rise or much place in this current chapter, but the next one, they take more of a rise. Then we have the idea of helping the ex-slaves. There's a Freedmen's Bureau that would provide resources to African Americans. Then we had the Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1871 was anti the Ku Klux Klan, which is a very bad organization that I can't even begin to describe. It was just a really horrible thing, and they're like especially rising during this time period as they intensely disagreed with African Americans having any sort of rights. And then we had the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which allowed African Americans the civil rights to public accommodations, transportations, and jury duty. So they have a lot of the rights that white men have, and of course, we're going to have some outrage about this, but we don't have to talk about that right now. But we should discuss how successful Reconstruction was. We have the changing position of ex-slaves. We have Hiram Rhodes Revels, an African American man who replaces Jefferson Davis in the Senate, and we see his political cartoon at the right, where this black man has replaced the guy who was very racist and led this entire war against the idea of abolishing slavery. So that was sort of a funny moment in history. We also have these historically black colleges and universities forming, which is just generally a good idea because it's going to lead to a lot of African Americans getting that education, not being restricted from college admissions to their race, which is a very good idea. And we also have them being more active in politics. We have this image at the bottom where we see the black members compared to the white members who are represented by the blue. Louisiana has a 50-50 state. Florida has a 40-60. South Carolina 61-39. So although some states don't have this majority shown, this is very, very significant when it comes to taking roles in politics and also implementing a lot of these new policies because the more African Americans there are, the more likely these policies are going to go through. However, the South is very, very angry about this. Their racism was really accepted, really okay. They make constant comedy about it. It was really relatable. And now they're like, yo, this guy is equal to me now? No, that isn't right. So they decide, the first thing, to put restrictions onto voting. There are three main ways they did this. They had the grandfather clause, which was if your grandfather could not vote before some kind of year, probably like 1830, something like that, then you could not vote. Pretty much saying if your family couldn't vote a while ago, then you could vote, which is a really weird idea, and it was only installed because of that African Americans got rights, so it's very targeted towards them. And there are also poll taxes, which made you have to pay in order to vote. And ex slaves were almost always poor because they were never able to get money. Also, it's very hard for them to get jobs after this because there's a lot of racism and discrimination. So, this is also very unfair towards them. And there's also literacy tests now, which aside from African Americans having the disadvantage of not being allowed to really have education, these questions were vague and they could be answered in multiple ways. So whoever was administering the test could very easily discriminate against the person. We also have the work relations and how African Americans intertwined with that. There were the black codes where it said African Americans were not allowed to own guns, even though it was in the Second Amendment. And they said if they don't have a job, we'll force you to work without pay. So if you have difficulty getting a job because the system is really racist in the South, then you are going to probably work on a plantation for no pay. aka just slavery all over again. Then we have sharecropping, which is also slavery all over again. It's where these people who are very poor are trying to make some kind of money, trying to get some kind of job. So they go to this rich plantation owner and they say, hey, I need a job. And the plantation owner is like, okay, I know you're poor. I'll give you seeds, I'll give you tools. You are going to farm on this land, right? So maybe after a season of farming, maybe two, they give their crops to the person who owns the land. And the person who owns the land is like, yo, this actually isn't enough. So essentially, the system was placed so people would be in debt for a few years to these landowners, at minimum a few years. And it was just a really unfair system because it targeted those who did not have jobs, who were very poor, and that often ended up being the African Americans. And overall, it continued slavery. Even though technically it wasn't slavery because they were getting paid, but the pay was going right back to the landowner to pay off their debts that were established by the landowner. Then we have our segment of court rulings. There's a lot of court rulings during this time period, but I saw four that I thought were the most significant. So there was Bradwell v. Illinois. So Illinois could not allow a woman to go into law. Like they would not, even though they had a Civil Rights Act that said a woman could have any kind of job. It wouldn't be restricted based on gender. And she even was getting a lot of the education done. All she needed was a final certification so she could go into it. And the US Supreme Court said that women belong in civil jobs, such as the household. Yes, that was a quote, so that didn't work out. That's just part of the suffragette movement. I didn't see much about it, so I figured I'd just include that. Then we have 1876, US versus Reese et al. We have how the court restricted congressional power to enforce the KKK Act, saying that the 15th Amendment did not guarantee anyone the right to vote. It was just that they couldn't base it on race. So they could base it on education and they could base it on money, etc. It was just not a good thing overall because it was targeted. It was targeted. It was only put in place after those amendments were put in place. So there was a direct connection. Then we have 1876 U.S. versus Cruikshank. I'm not sure exactly how to say that, but the white supremacists were accused of attacking African Americans, and the court would not protect the victims because their amendments only prevent discrimination offered by the states. So they said, yo, if you're assaulted, we aren't going to do anything because it technically wasn't us. So these two court cases really support each other because one said, oh yeah, we can't really enforce the KKK Act, which is going to prevent this kind of thing, but also we can't do anything if you are attacked because we did not do it. So they're just making the whole cycle continue, making it loop it back around itself. Then we have 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson. This is one of the most significant in the long term, I'd say, where it was where Louisiana required railroads to separate white and black people into different passenger cars. And they said it was okay. This was alright because it's okay for it to be separate but equal. And this really confirmed segregation. This because although they said separate but equal, they weren't going to enforce that it was equal because they didn't have the rights to enforce that it was equal. So overall, it's going to really confirm segregation in the school systems and bathrooms, restaurants, etc. And there's going to be a very huge disadvantage for many, many years. But also we have Grant's Reconstruction. I didn't really talk about him too much because he's really at the end there, but he's a pretty cool dude. Aside from like all the corruption that was going on, it was theorized he was doing stuff with money and whatever. But we're not going to focus on that right now. There was the Panic of 1873, which is a 6-year economic depression. He was trying his best through that. It sort of makes Reconstruction die a little bit as people focus on the economy, but he dealt with it the best he could. He tried to install anti-KKK laws. He installed the 15th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1870 and 1875, and he worked on the peace policy with the Indians, so he wasn't even just focusing on African Americans, he was focusing on the other minorities present as well. As some of the Homestead Acts, people were moving towards that western area, and a lot of the Indians were there because they thought that was their safe space. They already had a lot of it taken away from them, so it's good that Grant was trying to make those connections and outreaches. Then we have the Compromise of 1877. Whenever we have the word compromise, we know it's going to end bad. So we have the election of 1876. This is where we have Hayes versus Tilden. And if we look at the electoral vote, it's 50% to 50%, which, oh my goodness. And we see that Hayes won by just only 1 vote. Then we have the popular vote, on the other hand, where Tilden gets 51% of the vote, while Hayes gets only the 48%. So it's relatively 50-50 in both ways. This is very unique. It's very, oh my goodness, you know. So Tilden won the popular vote, but he only needed 1 more electoral to win the presidency. So the South is super duper pissed because look at where our red states are. We see Texas, Missouri, Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, a bunch of these and we still have some northern states, but for the most part, a lot of the southern states are the red ones. So the South is like, yo, we might secede again, not gonna lie, and the North is really, really scared of another war, so they make this compromise. The Republicans, aka the blue states, get the Hayes as president. That's all they get. However, the Democrats get a lot more. They get the federal troops that are in the South withdrawn completely. So we talked about earlier how the radical Republicans enforced the military zones to make sure they weren't just continuing slavery behind their back. Yeah, that's over now, I guess. And then they had a Southerner added to Hayes's cabinet. Then we had supported federal spending on the internal improvements in the South. So the South gets the military completely out, a bunch of money, and more military power from that Southerner in the cabinet. And the effect of the compromise that the Republicans are seen as scaredy cats. They're seen as like in this political cartoon, they're a little lamb. Well, the South is this big lion. And a lot of racial equality progression is set back or also not progressed much further. And so, Reconstruction comes to an end in 1877, which was when the compromise took place. So thank you very much for watching. I know history is hard to study, but we got through it. I hope you have a good day, and